If you had lived in London in the early 19th century, it would have been what historians refer to as a stank. There wasn't any indoor plumbing, and so people did their business and threw it out the window, and it washed away into the River Thames. And as it turns out, it's not a great solution for a whole city to hurl its grumpies into the main source of drinking water. So what to do? Well, Big Daddy Government is going to get involved and start fixing this problem and many other problems quick, fast, and in a hurry. So let's consider how governments began to play a bigger role in people's lives during this period of European history. If you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. Now, in the decades and centuries preceding the Industrial Revolution, those in power essentially wanted governments to stay out of their business. And this was a core idea of liberalism, namely that the government should operate according to a laissez-faire policy. And that's just a French word that means leave alone or let alone. But in the middle of the 19th century, with the significant problems of overcrowding and crime created by urbanization, people began to demand liberal reforms of their government. In other words, people wanted the government to get involved in solving their problems, to go from laissez-faire to interventionist. You see, as capitalistic societies grew more complex, it was no longer practical nor desirable for many citizens that the government stay completely out of things. Rather, the government was now seen as the chief mover of social reform. Now, let me give you some examples of the kinds of reform enacted by governments during this period, and let's begin with the reforms in public health. Edwin Chadwick of Britain sought reform for the poor. By his estimation, one of the most significant factors of the poor remaining poor was disease. After studying the situation thoroughly, he found that diseases were transmitted among the poor in such high numbers because of their filthy and unsanitary living environment. This became the basis of Britain's first public health legislation, by which Britain built modern sanitary systems, including sewers and clean water systems. And those reforms were massively popular among the people. So the British Parliament continued enacting reforms because they were popular, and the working class began to trust their government more and decrease the possibility of violent class struggle. Additionally, since many of these reforms were the policies of Britain's Liberal Party, they grew to have a majority in the Parliament by 1906. Second, government pushed for reform in terms of urban planning. Napoleon III charged George Haussmann with essentially tearing down the old Paris and building a new one. The old Paris was overcrowded in the extreme, and especially in the poor sections, disease ran rampant. Over the course of 20 years, Haussmann plowed down nearly every building in Paris. He widened boulevards significantly, which, in addition to creating more open space, also meant that the revolutionaries couldn't build their barricades so easily.
Sorry, guys.
Anyway, Haussmann built two massive public parks, one on the rich side of town and one on the poor side of town. Additionally, the city installed sewers and aqueducts to help mitigate disease. And as a result of his magnificent success, the new Paris became a model for new ventures in urban planning all throughout Europe. Third, governments developed professional police forces. Because of the terrific overcrowding in industrial cities, it was no longer tenable to keep order with just a few officers hired by local people. So in the mid-19th century, governments began training and hiring professional police forces to keep the peace. And related to this, governments began to reform their prison systems as well. Motivated by the work of reformers like Elizabeth Fry in Britain, prisons were now segregated by gender, and inmates were given opportunities for education and employment. And the important point to remember here is this: these reforms were led by governments, although they were inspired by public opinion, prominent individuals, and charity organizations. Now, between 1870 and 1914, the majority of European governments passed compulsory education laws to get boys and girls between the ages of 6 to 12 into school. And if you're watching this video, you are an inheritor of those fair laws, and you may be wondering, why did they do that? Well, governments passed compulsory education laws for basically three reasons. First, they passed these to keep public order. Remember what we've seen in previous videos regarding children, namely that an increasing amount of laws were being passed that made it illegal for them to work below a certain age. And if you got a bunch of children running around with no jobs and nothing to do but cause trouble, well then, stick them in public school and order is restored. The second reason governments passed these laws was because they deemed schools to be a prime environment to engender nationalism in their young people. For most states, public education was seen as a way to shape a generation of children into patriots for their state. With everyone learning the same language and the same history, this had the effect of creating a more integrated population. And the third reason governments passed these laws was for economic growth. In the midst of the Second Industrial Revolution, high-paying jobs were becoming more technical and more specialized. Therefore, compulsory education prepared students to be more suited for those kinds of jobs. So a good example of this kind of reform was the development of kindergartens in Germany. Now, kindergarten was the brainchild of German reformer Friedrich Froebel. He believed that very young children ought to be educated primarily through play, and to that end, he established kindergartens that provided opportunity for children to build with geometric blocks and engaged in play-based activities. Now, the Revolution of 1848 in the German states caused the government to shut down these kindergartens, but by then the idea had spread to other European states who implemented them with some success. Alright, it's the end of Unit 6, so you can click here to grab my AP Euro review pack if you're studying for your exams, and all your dreams will come true. Click here if you want to see the other videos for Unit 6, and if you want me to keep making these videos, then the way you can tell me that is by subscribing. I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.